Paul, you want to go first? You want me to go?
Sure, I'll go ahead. So, Paul Reed, I'm the VP of Adversary Research at AttackIQ, and we'll talk a bit more about what my team does during the presentation.
Uh, Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, everyone. You're on the West Coast. I, I am Spencer Pollock. I'm a data protection cybersecurity attorney with McDonald Hopkins, and I'll also kind of give you some flavor and background about our role with the cybersecurity and privacy side as we move forward. But yeah, I guess to kick off, I think we wanted to talk about the relationship. Oh, let's yeah.
Sure. So I think to start, before we get into the slides, it would be helpful to touch on the relationship between legal and the adversary research team when it comes to breach. So what does that relationship look like from either side?
Yeah, I'll jump in, because I definitely think it's a unique relationship that definitely is underestimated and kind of not really understood. A lot of times you have, when I talk to clients, they really just think it's a cybersecurity side rather than the legal side. But when you're looking at both a proactive approach and an incident response, you have the inner workings and the interrelationship between both. They run very much in a parallel path and rely on each other. So my big role when it comes to the pre-incident side is really helping identify gaps with the administrative safeguards, right? To help clients really prepare and one, be compliant with incident response planning, vendor due diligence, written information security policies. You think about just the general laws that apply to you and showing reasonableness. But I also have to rely and lean on people like Paul and his team for the technical safeguards and the technical side and the research and the kind of anything on the cybersecurity, right? Because when a breach happens too, both sides are working in tandem and you need both sides to keep you compliant. So if you really just think about the two safeguards, the administrative and the technical, those are basically the legal and the security side, and they work hand in hand. But I'll kick it to Paul too to get his opinion.
Thanks, Spencer. So, from our standpoint, our role is to prevent breaches from happening. So, we want to try to get in front of things and make sure that we don't have to talk to people like Spencer. Unfortunately, breaches do happen. So, when they do happen, we have to be there to support as part of a larger response team. And our role at that time is to provide the details and background, some ideas on the attackers, type of attacks, what's taken place to Spencer so he can work with the overall organization to have a proper response to what's happened. So I really want to try to prevent things from taking place. We want to build up that cyber resiliency and give you the tools to be able to stop the attackers before they attack you, but at least, at the very least, know whether or not your existing compensating controls and your other solutions you have in place will actually protect you or detect from an ongoing cyber attack.
I think just to finish this point, it's a it's a partnership. This is a team game. This is definitely a team game. I'd say 10 years ago, it was much more siloed, where the legal's doing their own thing, the security was doing their own thing. But what we've really learned is this is a team sport, right? It's no longer individualized, and it's team sport between my team, Paul's team, and your organization, where we're all working in tandem because we're all working for the same goal, but we all need each other. And so that's where the synergy comes in and having that synergy beforehand and working that proactive side to really understand to prevent that breach is so important.
Cool. So we could probably get into the slides, Paul.
Wonderful. So first of all, thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. Again, Paul Reed, I'm the VP of Adversary Research at AttackIQ. So we are called the ART team. And what exactly does the Adversary Research team do? So we're a team of cybersecurity researchers. We produce content for our products, and we support our customers with timely content and testing to do breach attack simulations and to be able to test your defenses and find out if you can protect and detect ongoing cyber threats. What's interesting about the team is we're geographically located throughout the world. So it allows us to bring a national perspective to the cyber conversation. We're just simply not focused in North America or Europe, but we're actually located throughout the world. It also allows us to have overlapping time zones. So when we are working on things or working with a customer, we can provide additional hours of opportunity in which to collaborate and to solve problems. And most importantly, we're practitioners. We have people on our team who've done red teaming, blue teamers, we have malware researchers, and we also have threat hunters as well. And that's really important, right? We need to understand what the adversary is doing and how they're trying to do what they do against you to provide you with the best possible simulations to prevent them from taking place. And lastly, we understand the cyber challenges you face. We've lived them ourselves, either on the vendor side or on the customer side. So we understand the pain points that you're feeling. And lastly, we really talk about think bad, do good, right? We want to think like an adversary, but yet do good things for your organization to help prevent you from those adversaries potentially attacking you. So I'm going to actually start off this presentation with a bit of a sneak peek. We're about to release our 2024 year in review report. The reason why I bring this up is you'll see in the slides today actually some statistics we've gathered over the past year from our customers and the use of our product. And there's some really telling things that came out in that. So I just want to give you some background on how this report came together. So we're looking at attack simulations across our customer base, from very small companies to extremely large enterprises. We're evaluating the detection and prevention trends across organizations. So how well is your EDR, NDR, your web application firewall? How are your mitigating controls actually doing what they're doing? And whether or not you're actually able to prevent it from taking place or only detect it. We're helping to identify gaps in security coverage and identify areas for improvement. And we really want to provide actionable insights. If we can't give you something more than just statistics or numbers, then we're not helping you be better. So the insights we gain from this is really important. Some of the key findings we found: strong early stage threat prevention is important. For example, especially around multi-factor authentication, credential protection, we're seeing so much taking place in terms of credential stealers and other types of attacks against your user base. So we really got to get in front of that. And we're really seeing a lot of weaknesses in detecting late stage attacks, particularly around exfiltration and command and control. That's kind of what the report shows. So that'll be coming out in the next several weeks, so stay tuned. We'll certainly be sharing that across all the usual channels. I think it's important to understanding the difference between prevention and detection, just so we can level set that. So prevention, we want to stop the known attack techniques before execution. We want to, as some people say, get left of boom, right? We want to get on that left side of the attack life cycle and stop things early on before something bad takes place. Detection, well, that's where identifying the malicious activity when prevention fails, right? So can we at least detect that something bad's taking place to give you a warning of attack or warning of compromise that something bad has taken place? And detection first strategies actually improve your response time and reduce dwell time, right? We don't want the attackers in our organization longer than we need to. So let's talk a bit about the evolving threat landscape we've seen over the past year. We see obviously that threats are increasing, volume is increasing, all the usual type of things we'd expect is actually taking place. But we saw a real rise in ransomware, cyber extortion, and nation state threats happening, right? The Volt Typhoon is the most immediate one that comes to mind in terms of nation state activity that impacted such a large portion of the world, and in particular North America and the US with their compromises. We want to shift from prevention only to detection first, right? We want to try to detect things before we have to prevent them. Prevention alone is not sufficient. We need to try to do better. And this brings us into continuous threat exposure management. So we've all heard this term before, but it really provides that real-time exposure and asset validation that's needed to build up that cyber resiliency in an ever-evolving threat landscape. Spencer, you want to talk about some of the legal implications behind this?
Yeah, and I would say to start, in terms of the regulatory investigations, so everything you do before an incident is really going to provide the basis on the legal side and compliance side for me to have that narrative. So when I'm talking about regulatory investigations, think about when their breach happens and you have to go provide notifications to individuals. You also have to provide notifications to regulators, state attorney generals, Office of Civil Rights under Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, insurance commissioners, finance departments, banking departments. You name it. There's a regulator you have to notify. And then what happens after that, and what we saw in 2024 was a huge uptick of regulatory investigations where they'll come back and they'll start asking questions. And there's three things they really care about. They care about what you did before, what you did during, and what you're doing after. If you come to me and I haven't met you for the before part, I can take care of you on the during and after. But if you haven't really been working with someone like Paul or me, someone else out there on the legal side, the security side, to really get buttoned up, it's hard to show a narrative. Because just imagine if a regulator comes to you and says, okay, tell me about the things you've done. And is expecting you to do things, its size, scope, and complexity for your organization. So your judge, Spencer's Widget Shop, is judged against Spencer's Widget Shop 2. Spencer's Widget Shop is not judged against Target and Target's budget when it comes to cybersecurity and the administrative safeguards in place. So, but you're still judged on that level. So a regulator is going to say, what did you do and was it reasonable? And if you haven't done anything, right, if you haven't done what Paul was discussing in terms of maybe MFA or a patching policy, and if you don't have those plans, procedures, and protocols in place, they're not going to find it reasonable. And we're not going to have a narrative for that. And so we saw a really high uptick in fines and penalties from these investigations for organizations who were not doing what they needed to beforehand. The during is a little easier. And easier, I mean, is especially if you're working with the right people and then you do the right things, and then the afterwards, when you're then plugging the gaps after moving forward. So those are easy narratives to build because they're real-time narratives. The other part we saw was a huge uptick in class action lawsuits. So when you notify people, all it takes is one person to find a plaintiff attorney to then start a class action. Now, could they certify the class? It really depends on the amount of people that they can get. There are state thresholds. Some are 50 people, some are 100 people, some are 200 people. But it's a low threshold. If this was 5 years ago, I would say unless you had several hundreds of thousands of people, there was no really concern over class actions. The problem is none of these have gone to trial. They all settle. So plaintiff attorneys, it's basically blood in the water for sharks now. And they are monitoring every time you have to notify a regulator. Different states will publicize it. So they'll watch for it and then they'll start advertising about this to find one person. So now we're getting class actions in the hundreds of people because they know it's going to settle. They know the defense costs are a lot and they know it's not going to trial. So we saw a large uptick in these class actions. And so understanding how to mitigate that liability, and I'll get into the data retention later. But there's ways to mitigate your liability on the class action side because those class actions cost millions of dollars, millions, to settle and to basically get rid of because nobody is going to take them to trial because the liability is immense for that. And then the final part is we did see a really big uptick in reputational harm where customers were leaving organizations after a data breach, especially the ones that didn't have that good narrative to present to their customer base and their client base. Because once again, it's 2025. I mean, last year was 2024. But no longer are we in a position to say, well, we didn't have the budget to do something, right? You do have budget and you're judged off your size, scope, and complexity. So we really want to protect your reputation. And to do that, you have to do the things beforehand to show that you are taking the reasonable steps. Because I think the uptick went from 3 to 6 or 7% of customers and clients leaving organizations after a data breach. And it goes beyond that too. It's word of mouth, right? It's organizations talking about Spencer's Widget Shop and how they were breached, but also what they didn't do beforehand.
Thank you. So some emerging cyber threat actors to watch in 2025. So as we look at what our customers are testing against, we see some trends emerging from that. So obviously nation state groups is one we're all really worried about. And when we think about the top four, it's Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And so we sampled a few of the different threat groups there just to give you a feeling of how well customers' environments are detecting, protecting them. So we look for something like APT29. We see a high prevention rate, right, in the 60s and 70s. But there are some detection gaps still remaining, right? Only about 55% of the activity that APT29 took place, or we simulated taking place in the customer's environment, was actually detected. China, APT 41, again, some strong detection, greater than 50%. But there's some visibility gaps, again, in detection, about 28% of detection rates. For North Korea, again, Lazarus Group, APT 38, 30 to 50% detection rates indicate moderate but inconsistent coverage. So again, for those type of threats, we're not seeing the mitigating controls doing what they're supposed to be doing in the customer's environments to protect them. Lastly, probably Iran is probably the one with the least amount of prevention and detections that we saw last year. This could be chalked up to that it's not something that everyone sees. It's not something that a lot of our customers feel may be a target of, and as such, they don't have the necessary mitigating controls or the level of mitigating controls they need to protect against nation state. And of course, there's some financially motivated groups as well. Here's just one example: Carbangic. 20% prevention, 50% detection, and for FinAid it was 60-51, right? We know FinAid and Fin7 are still posing risks. My adversary research team in the next couple of days is going to be releasing an update to our Fin7 research, so stay tuned for that as well. Again, we'll announce that probably across LinkedIn and our other channels. So why testing threat detection matters, right? Why should I be testing my mitigating controls, and why is that important to me as an organization? A lot of times we still have periodic testing, right? We'll do the annual pen testing, we'll do the regulatory required ones, we may do some ad hoc work throughout the year. But when we start looking at ongoing CTEM type of activity, we're starting to see major weaknesses in late stage attack detection. So if we look at it from a MITRE standpoint, command and control detection rate has fallen off to about 28%. Exfiltration detection rate's fallen to about 24%. And then account manipulation, which is one we see an awful lot of, prevention's around 20, detection's around 22. I think a lot of this falls to the nature of these type of attacks and the fact that attackers are continuously innovating and finding new ways to do these type of MITRE techniques. And as such, it's become upon us as supporters of you to make sure that we have the latest content out there to help you understand whether or not your systems are doing what they need to do. And as well, you need to talk to your existing vendors and ask them, are they staying up on the latest techniques and tools being used by these threat actors? So this leads into this whole concept of adversarial exposure validation. So continuously testing and to improve your defenses. So that's something that we're seeing take place coming out in the marketplace. We have a number of people in the industry now talking about that. And really, to me, from my standpoint on the art team, is that adversarial exposure is so important, right? Can we help detect or help you detect and understand the adversaries that are actually targeting you? We'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. So if we try to look at this in a little bit more detail, what really is AEV? Well, it's a structured approach to validation, right? We want to have a regular program of identifying adversarial exposures and then validating those exposures to make sure that we can become more resilient and really, find ourselves moving beyond just simply compliance, but actually having meaningful understanding of our security in terms of real risk exposure, right? Are we validating against real world scenarios the best we can? So the key benefits that we get out of doing AAV is we get to proactively identify gaps in our security, potentially before the adversaries exploit them. Part of that adversarial exposure is understanding what adversaries are targeting you. And that's done a number of different ways, right? One is through traditional CTI or from observation what's taking place on our edges. It could be some human intel you might have, but we really want to understand who those adversaries are. We want to increase our resilience against ransomware and advanced threats, right? Ransomware continues to be an ongoing threat that all companies face, regardless of the industry you're in, regardless of the size of the company as well. Most recently, a number of our school boards here in Ontario, where I live, were hit with ransomware through a third-party supplier. So, it's something that's ongoing and continuing. And it's not something I think we're going to see go away anytime soon. We want to validate the threat detection responses against real world attack scenarios. Again, it's really important to have that real world simulation being done to understand if you're going to detect it or not. So what are some proactive steps for breach prevention and resilience, right? What can we do to help ourselves? So adopting that continuous testing mindset we talked about, right? Simulate real-world attack scenarios, look at your MITRE techniques, understand where your exposures are, understand where you have good detections, understand where you have gaps. That's really important too. We want to test and validate security controls all the time. Often we have situations where we'll help a customer who's been breached, and we'll find out that they were all good and everything was fine up until someone made a breaking change or pushed out a change, right? And it wasn't detected in time. That's why that continuous validation is so important, is that if changes do happen, whether inadvertent or inadvertent, we know whether or not it's going to change our security posture. And again, automation as much as we can of those workflows to close the security gaps is good. And really prioritize your threat exposure, right? We can't be everywhere all the time. We don't have infinite budgets. We have more than enough patching to do, and more than enough updates to do, more than enough upgrades to do. So we really need to focus on those high risk attack paths, right? We need to have tools that provide us visibility into what is the attack path of my organization if I'm breached. Where can attackers get to if they come in through a particular point or through a particular edge? What of my most critical resources are now exposed to that attack? And can I find ways to interdict and find common choke points across those attack paths to thwart an attack if it does take place? And really, integration with high quality threat intelligence is really important, right? We need to understand the level of threat, hopefully do some attribution of the threats, and then know what threat actors are looking at us. So let's talk a bit about this from a legal standpoint.
So when we're looking at the legal one here, the biggest takeaway from my perspective for you all is prepare, 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 right? So incorporate everything that Paul was just saying. But now let's look too on the policy side. So I'll give you a quick statistic. An average data breach, and I think it's gone up, but this is about a year ago or 2 years ago, costs about $4.2 million. I've done about 900 breaches. I can tell you that's pretty close to the average of what we see, unfortunately. But companies that have an incident response plan, an incident response team, so basically a plan and a team, and then they practice it, save around 2.6 million. I always think an incident response plan is so crucial from both the technical side and the legal side. When a data breach happens, you don't really have months at that point, if you haven't already prepared, to get ready to deal with it. It's literally a class 5 tornado that has touched down without a warning. Everything gets thrown off. Your systems are offline, your communications are down, you're being threatened by this hacking group, this criminal. So if you imagine, if you practice for this, if you've gone through this crisis scenario, you're so much better prepared in how to mitigate those harms. Other ways to think about the preparation is data retention. Okay, so we are all hoarders. Human beings naturally are hoarders. It's a lot harder to hoard, though, physically. You should have seen my office about 6 months ago. There was just boxes upon boxes of just stuff. But I saw those boxes and I was like, let me get rid of these physical items. Much easier to hoard information on your computer because you don't see it. The problem for that is the more information you're keeping is the more liability you have. Because if you get hit with, say, a ransomware attack and that information was accessed or obtained, all of that information, if it's sensitive, creates liability. I don't care if it was from 20 years ago or 1 day ago. So having a data retention policy and sticking by it and really getting rid of data you don't need is a huge preparation. Vendor management. Every 6 months, we're seeing a a catastrophic event almost, where it's a vendor. Think about your large vendors you work with, an ADP, a Salesforce, AWS. I mean, God help us all if AWS went down. But one like large vendors. So about 3 weeks ago was PowerSchool. PowerSchool works with a lot of schools, K through 12 schools. They got hit with a ransomware attack, massive implications for notifications of individuals impacted. 6 months before that, it was CDK. CDK worked with half of the auto dealerships in this country, took them down, and they were not able to service or do sales for about 2 weeks. Start thinking about the vendor you work with, the vendors you work with, and start ranking it by pain points. Who can cause you the most pain, right, if they went down? So it's no longer just you. Think about having a castle. We used to, about 10 years ago, everything was centralized. All of our back office operations was centralized. But that's only one entry into the castle. Now we've got hundreds or tens of different entry points into our castle because of all the information we're pushing out and all the access we're letting in to our castle. You have to think about the vendors you work with the most that can cause you the most harm if they have a cyber attack, and start doing due diligence, asking the questions, same questions that Paul is really presenting and I'm presenting, you really want to present to these vendors, and make sure you have good contractual obligations. Contractually obligating for them to notify you if they have a breach of a security incident, right? So not every breach, not all incidents, all breaches start with an incident, not all incidents become a breach. But you still want to know, because this is your information too that they could be housing. You want them to have insurance as well. Shifting to cyber insurance, you want to have a good cyber insurance policy, right? Because I just gave you the numbers about the average data breach cost. You want to have a financial mitigator. They'll also get you to qualified parties to help you in the event of a data breach, right? You don't want to be calling somebody who's not like Paul or not like me. That's not even a hard sell. Know someone like Paul, know someone like me, right? But also talk to your cyber insurance carrier and make sure that they're approved to work with you. This will also help mitigate any costs of downtime. So these are basically the three big things I look at before an incident, beyond all the technical safeguards that Paul said.
That's great. Thank you. The last one was the data retention. I think you touched on that one.
No, I did. Sorry. Yeah, we already just discussed
Okay.
that.
So one of the things we're seeing is we're seeing that move to cloud, right? That's been going on for several years. But now we're seeing this hybrid environment where we're living half on-prem and half in the cloud. And that really changes our threat exposure validation, right? We've certainly expanded our attack surfaces. Misconfigurations, privilege escalations are becoming easier and easier now with cloud services. So you can think of something like an Okta or other types of companies like that, where you can do centralized account management, centralized privilege management. And that's really made us more secure in many ways. At the same time, too, it's given now the attackers are single point of focus, single point of target, that if I can expose you there, I get access to everything, your Salesforce, your GitHub, everything becomes exposed to me. So it's really important to make sure that you have good cloud exposure management. Live threat intelligence, again, is a key to predicting, preventing breaches, right? We want to make sure that you have the best threat intelligence in time to help with that. Test your cloud defenses, right? Just like your adversaries do, right? You know your adversaries are out there testing your edges and your perimeters all the time. So it's better that you find your exposures first before an attacker does. So some final takeaways and calls to action as we come to the bottom of the hour. Cyber resiliency is very important, right? It requires traditional security, but it also demands you that continuous threat and validation aspects of it, right? That's CTEM and AEV stuff we talked about. Again, adversary exposure validation is very important, right? It's that proactive activity of protecting yourselves. Prioritize your high risk attack techniques and emerging threats in 2025, right? Where do you think they're coming from? Who do you think they're going to be? What could they be after? Think some of that through. Adopt a CTEM approach, right? For that real time security validation along with your AEV. We want to have them working in tandem. So, your next steps, let's evaluate your security. Let's implement continuous breach and attack simulations, and let's ensure your threat detection defenses are tested regularly, right? Changes happen, mistakes are made. We may think we're secure today, but tomorrow we may not be because of something inadvertent we did. We're all human. Mistakes do happen. With that, I thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over.
Awesome. So we are at the 30-minute mark, but we will answer a couple of questions. So one that I see is, if an organization suffers a breach, what should they prioritize within the first 24 to 48 hours?
So from my perspective, one, you want to have containment, but you want to make sure you know who you're going to loop in. So this is where the preparation comes from. So to me, you always want to loop in an attorney, because then they'll bring in a party, say like AttackIQ, under their umbrella to protect all of the work being done. And then you'll have a qualified party like AttackIQ that can walk you through the remediation and containment efforts. Because whenever you call me to start, I would call someone like Paul to come in. And then Paul can talk about the important steps at that point, because then I would have you kind of under my umbrella.
I think from my standpoint, it's going to be obviously containment, mitigating the risk, mitigating the exposure. You don't want more data leaving your organization than necessarily. At the same time, too, there's always a desire to cut off access and cut off ability for the attackers to move. Sometimes, not always, and depending upon the maturity of the organization, you may want to actually observe those attackers for a little while longer so you can gather additional information about who they are and what they're really going after so that you can have a full picture of what took place. Preservation of first class logs, uh, that's really important. And again, you want to start your notifications as quick and as early as you can so the right teams can get engaged to help protect you.
Awesome. Let me, since we have, this one's for you, Spencer. What legal or compliance obligations remain after a breach has been resolved?
Oh, a lot. Well, so let's start with the front end when you have an incident. The first thing immediately you got to think about is contractual obligations, right? Because if you have contractual obligations that go to basically a suspected incident, I've seen clauses very broad, and I write very broad clauses about a suspected incident. Then you might have immediate notifications. If you're a business associate of a covered entity, those really come into play. That's the healthcare side. After you determine it is a breach, so incident, it becomes a breach through a legal analysis. If you do determine that, then the obligations are going to be one, industry dependent, and then two, state law dependent. So hypothetically, and it really then depends on the information involved. Think things you can't find on Google that can cause identity theft or financial harm, and if it was accessed or obtained. So if any of that information was accessed or obtained, once again, there's no universal definition, right? It really is a state by state analysis and a federal law analysis. But at that point, then you have to send notifications to individuals about the incident and then figure out what regulators you have to notify. So it could be state attorney generals, it could be OCR, could be departments of insurance, NYDFS, which is the financial arm in New York. So I think they answered the question, but I might have went off on a tangent.
No, I think you're good. And then just one more. This one I think you both could answer. What types of attacks are the most concerning today? And like what are we seeing the most, from the research side, Paul? And then Spencer, you're dealing with actual breaches that are happening. Is there any certain kind of attacks that you guys are seeing a lot and concerned about the most?
So I think from my standpoint, again, trying to prevent as much as you can, having the right mitigating controls in place. Um, And a lot of times when we investigate these breaches, we often reach a point where we say, if they had only, right? If they'd only had separation of duties, if they'd only had multi-factor authentications. So attacks today, they're going after the easiest paths in. So things like info stealers are really big right now. We're seeing a lot of breaches come in that way as opposed to traditional hacking methods or 0 days, though that still happens and they still do take place. We're going to see more and more of that. In terms of ransomware, we're going to see the whole double extortion thing, right? Holding your data encrypted and also threatening to release it at the same time. That continues to pay dividends. If you think of it this way, a lot of these ransomware groups operate on volume, right? If I can get, 1% or 3% of the customers I target to be breached and then get them to pay a ransom to me, then I'm making a really good living. So again, focus on prevention up front, detecting credential misuse, credential theft, and that will play out for you better in the long run.
Yeah, I would say from the legal perspective, it's the increased ransomware attacks and the sophistication, leveraging AI too, with business email compromises. On the ransomware side, obviously, it's still rampant with the triple extortion, encryption, locking your computers, stealing your information, holding you hostage with that, and then doing harassment campaigns, all in the effect to try to get you to pay a ransom. Business email compromises leading into wire fraud, big problem. Have multiple layers of authentication in play when you're doing wires, right? AI can be this easy to get people tricked, phishing attacks, and then wire.
Awesome. Yeah, I know being in cyber, we know the importance of the multi-factor authentication stuff. Although it is a pain in the butt sometimes, it's definitely helpful when, you're being attacked or targeted. Awesome. So I think that's all the questions that we have for today. Thank you, Paul and Spencer, for joining. And for anybody that's still on, we will be sending a recording out hopefully sometime tomorrow. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.